My uncle left his entire fortune to whoever could solve his riddle, so our family turned savage. Uncle Harrison was the black sheep who'd made millions in tech before anyone knew what that meant. He lived alone in a sprawling estate, collecting vintage cars and ancient puzzles. When he died at 67, we expected the usual: split the money, sell the house, move on. Instead, his lawyer read the strangest will I'd ever heard. "To my greedy relatives who only visit during holidays," it began, "I leave my entire $47 million fortune to whichever of you can solve the riddle hidden in my study. You have 30 days. If no one succeeds, everything goes to charity." The room erupted. My father immediately started barking orders like a general. Mom pulled out her phone to research puzzle-solving techniques. My cousin Derek, who'd dropped out of MIT, suddenly became the family's golden child. "This is insane," my aunt muttered. "We should contest it." But the lawyer explained that Uncle Harrison had been declared mentally competent just weeks before his death. The will was ironclad. Uncle Harrison had always been different from the rest of our family. While Dad and his brothers went into traditional careers, Dad became an insurance adjuster, Uncle Brad sold real estate, Uncle Mike worked construction, Harrison had dropped out of college in 1979 to write software for companies that barely understood what computers could do. Everyone thought he was throwing his life away. "He's living in a fantasy," I'd heard my grandfather say more than once. "Programming isn't a real job." But Uncle Harrison had seen something others missed. By 1985, he was consulting for Fortune 500 companies. By 1990, he'd sold his first software company for $3 million. He'd sold 2 more companies by 2000, each for increasingly absurd amounts of money. The family had gone from pitying him to being vaguely resentful of his success. The irony was that Uncle Harrison had tried to share his wealth over the years. He'd offered to pay for Derek's education when he dropped out of MIT. He'd given my parents a down payment for their house when Dad lost his job in 2008. He'd quietly paid medical bills for family members who couldn't afford them. But he'd done it all discreetly, never making anyone feel like charity cases. What people didn't know was how lonely his success had made him. I'd figured this out during our last conversation, 6 months before he died. He'd called to congratulate me on my college graduation, and somehow we'd ended up talking for 3 hours about everything except my degree. "Do you know why I never married?" he'd asked suddenly. "You never met the right person?" "I met several right people, but I could never tell if they loved me or loved what I could buy them." His voice had been sad, tired. "Money changes everything, kiddo, even when people don't mean for it to." That first day, we all played nice. We toured his study together, a room filled with thousands of books, antique globes, and display cases of mechanical puzzles. On his massive oak desk sat a single note: "Where shadows dance but never tire, and words hold power none require, the answer waits where stories sleep, but only one may take and keep." "It's obviously about the library," Derek announced confidently. "Shadows dance between the books, words hold power." "No," Dad interrupted. "It's about the basement. That's where the shadows would dance with the lighting." My cousin Tommy, barely 18 and just starting college, raised his hand tentatively. "What if it's not metaphorical? What if there are actual shadows dancing somewhere?" The adults looked at him like he'd suggested we consult a magic 8-ball. Tommy had always been the quiet one in our family, more interested in art than business, more observer than participant. But Uncle Harrison had always made time for him, encouraging his painting and asking about his latest projects. "That's actually not a bad thought," I said, but Derek was already explaining why Tommy's interpretation was naive. By day 3, the politeness cracked. I caught Derek sneaking into the house at 2 a.m. with a metal detector. Mom had enlisted a team of literature professors to analyze every book. Dad hired a construction crew to check for hidden compartments. What I hadn't mentioned was how quickly the house itself became a war zone. Family members had claimed territories like rival gangs. Derek had set up a command center in the dining room, complete with whiteboards covered in cryptographic analysis and timeline charts. Mom and Aunt Linda had taken over the living room, spreading research materials across every surface. Dad and Uncle Brad had commandeered the kitchen, using it as a staging area for their increasingly destructive search methods. The worst part was watching Uncle Harrison's carefully maintained home get systematically destroyed. He'd spent decades collecting beautiful things: antique furniture, rare books, delicate art pieces. Within a week, family members were moving everything without permission, searching for hidden compartments that probably didn't exist. I found my cousin Emma, Tommy's older sister, carefully cutting open the binding of a first-edition Dickens novel. "Emma, what are you doing?" She looked up, utility knife in hand. "Checking for hidden pages. This book is worth $15,000. Perfect place to hide something important. You're destroying it. It'll be worth a lot more than $15,000 if there's a clue inside." She went back to her methodical destruction. "Besides, once we find the answer, we can afford to replace it." Emma had always been practical to a fault, the cousin who balanced checkbooks at family gatherings and reminded everyone about tax deadlines. But watching her slice apart Uncle Harrison's beloved books felt like watching someone desecrate a grave. My cousin Jessica, who'd been sweet at the funeral, accused me of stealing her research notebook. "I saw you photographing my notes," she hissed. "I was taking pictures of the riddle," I shot back. "Liar. You always were jealous that I got better grades." The accusation stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. Jessica had always been the golden child, valedictorian, full scholarship to Northwestern, law degree from Harvard. But what hurt more was the implication that I'd stooped to theft over money. That's when I realized this wasn't about money anymore. This was unleashing every buried resentment our family had ever harbored. Mom and Dad stopped speaking after he caught her secretly meeting with a puzzle expert she'd found online. "We agreed to work together," he said coldly. "You agreed," she replied. "I never did." The expert Mom had hired was Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a linguistics professor who specialized in riddles and wordplay. She charged $200 an hour and had a 73% success rate with complex puzzles. What Mom didn't know was that Dad had hired the same woman the previous day, creating an ethical conflict that Dr. Chen resolved by refusing to work with either of them. My teenage sister started charging family members $20 to search her room, claiming she might have hidden clues there. My grandmother changed the locks on her house, convinced someone would break in to torture Uncle Harrison's secrets out of her. Grandma Betty was 91 and had been Uncle Harrison's favorite relative. He'd called her every Sunday for 40 years, visited her twice a week, and handled all her finances since Grandpa died. If anyone had inside information about the riddle, it would be her. But when family members started showing up at her retirement community with flowers and desperate questions, she'd panicked and called security. "They're acting like vultures," she told me during one of my visits. "Harrison always said this family would show its true colors if money was involved." I thought he was being cynical. Week 2 brought private investigators, professional code breakers, and a woman who claimed she could communicate with Uncle Harrison's spirit for $500 an hour. The psychic was named Madame Zelda, and she operated out of a strip mall between a nail salon and a Pizza Hut. Aunt Linda had found her through an online directory of spiritual consultants. For $500, Madame Zelda promised to contact Uncle Harrison's spirit and ask him directly about the riddle's solution. I wasn't there for the session, but according to Tommy, it was simultaneously hilarious and depressing. Madame Zelda had channeled Uncle Harrison's spirit, who apparently spoke in vague platitudes about looking within yourself and following your heart. When pressed for specific clues, the spirit had become evasive, suggesting the family needed to heal their relationships before the money could be revealed. It was obvious bullshit, Tommy told me later. But Aunt Linda was taking notes like it was a college lecture. Derek hired 3 graduate students to work in shifts, analyzing every word Uncle Harrison had ever written. Dad bought industrial scanning equipment to x-ray the walls. Mom started a spreadsheet tracking everyone's movements, convinced someone had already found the answer and was hiding it. The graduate students were fascinating to watch. They'd set up a digital humanities lab in Uncle Harrison's garage, scanning and analyzing thousands of pages of his personal writings. They'd found patterns in his word choices, tracked his evolving interests over decades, and created visualizations of his intellectual development. It was probably the most sophisticated literary analysis Uncle Harrison's writing had ever received. But they'd also missed the point entirely. They were treating Uncle Harrison like a historical figure to be decoded, rather than a person who'd loved puzzles for their elegance and simplicity. The breaking point came when I found my own sister rifling through my backpack. "Looking for something?" I asked. She didn't even look guilty. "Everyone else is cheating. Why shouldn't I?" My sister Megan was 17, and this whole situation had warped her understanding of normal family relationships. She'd started treating relatives like competitors in a reality show, forming alliances and betraying confidences without seeming to understand what she was doing to people she'd grown up loving. "Megan, we're family. We're supposed to trust each other." "Family?" She laughed bitterly. "Jessica hasn't spoken to Emma in a week because Emma accused her of stealing research. Dad hired someone to spy on Mom. Derek threatened to call the police when Uncle Brad touched his laptop. This isn't family anymore. It's Survivor." She was right, and that realization hit me like a physical blow. Uncle Harrison's final puzzle wasn't just revealing hidden money. It was revealing hidden truths about who we really were when our worst impulses were unleashed. That night, I sat alone in Uncle Harrison's study, staring at the riddle. My family was destroying itself over money that might not even exist. Maybe Uncle Harrison had planned this. Maybe watching us tear each other apart was his final joke. I read the riddle again. "Where shadows dance but never tire, and words hold power none require, the answer waits where stories sleep, but only one may take and keep." Everyone had focused on the first 2 lines. But what if the study door slammed open? Derek stood there, wild-eyed and desperate. "Step away from the desk," he said. "What?" "I know you found something. I've been watching the security cameras I installed. You've been here every night for an hour, always touching the same spot." He wasn't wrong. I had been running my fingers along a strange groove in the desk's edge, but I hadn't found anything. Yet. "Derek, I haven't solved anything. You're lying." He pulled out a small crowbar. "Move. Now." I stepped back as Derek approached the desk. He wasn't the same person who'd helped me with calculus homework 5 years ago. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes wrinkled like he'd been sleeping in his car. The family fortune had turned him into someone I didn't recognize. Derek had always been the smart one in our family, the kid who built robots in middle school and got early admission to MIT. But something had broken inside him during freshman year. He'd started calling home less. His grades slipped, and by Christmas he was talking about meaningless pursuits and the futility of academic achievement. When he dropped out junior year, his parents had cut him off completely. "Derek, look at yourself. Uncle Harrison would be horrified." "Uncle Harrison is dead." He jammed the crowbar into the groove I'd been examining. "And I'm done being the family disappointment." The irony was that Uncle Harrison had never seen Derek as a disappointment. At family gatherings, he'd pull Derek aside to discuss programming languages and emerging technologies. When Derek dropped out, Uncle Harrison was the only one who didn't lecture him about wasted potential. "You know he offered you a job," I said, watching Derek destroy the beautiful woodwork. 3 different times. You never even returned his calls. Derek paused mid-swing. He told you about that. He told everyone. He said you had the best intuitive understanding of complex systems he'd ever seen. I gestured at the destruction around us. This isn't what he wanted for you. You don't know what he wanted. Derek resumed his attack on the desk. Nobody knew what he wanted. That's why we're all here destroying each other for riddles and money. Wood splintered as he pried at each panel. Nothing. Just solid oak underneath. After 20 minutes of systematic destruction, he threw the crowbar across the room. It shattered a glass display case filled with antique chess sets, sending ivory pieces scattering across the Persian rug. This is your fault, he snarled. If you'd just shared what you found, I didn't find anything. But Derek was already storming out, probably to update whatever twisted alliance he'd formed with other family members. I'd learned about the alliances by accident, overhearing phone calls, catching whispered conversations. Dad and Uncle Brad had teamed up, pooling resources to hire the most expensive consultants. Mom had formed a secret partnership with Aunt Linda, sharing research while pretending to work alone. Even my teenage cousins had their own conspiracy, using social media to crowdsource puzzle solutions from their friends. The alliances shifted daily. Yesterday's partners became today's rivals when someone suspected betrayal or discovered a new lead. Tommy had started keeping a chart tracking who was speaking to whom, updating it multiple times per day as relationships fractured and reformed. Alone again, I stared at the ruined desk. Uncle Harrison's beautiful antique furniture, destroyed by greed. I started picking up wood splinters, feeling sick about the damage. The desk had been in his family for 4 generations. I'd heard him tell that story dozens of times. His great-grandfather had carved it by hand after immigrating from Ireland, working on it by candlelight after 14-hour days in the steel mills. That's when I noticed something strange. Where Derek had gouged the deepest, something glinted underneath. Not wood, metal. I used my fingernails to scrape away more wood shavings. A small brass plate was embedded in the desk, so thin it was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Engraved on it were 4 tiny symbols: a crescent moon, an open book, a key, and an hourglass. My heart raced. This had to be part of the riddle. But I heard footsteps in the hallway. I quickly scattered wood chips over the brass plate and pretended to clean up Derek's mess. Uncle Harrison had always said the best hiding places were ones people would walk past every day without noticing. He'd been right. Mom appeared in the doorway, took one look at the destruction, and sighed. Let me guess. Derek had another breakthrough. Something like that. She stepped carefully around the broken glass, her heels crunching on chess pieces. Mom had always been the practical one in our family, the accountant who balanced everyone's books and remembered everyone's birthdays. But the past 2 weeks had changed her. She'd started wearing Uncle Harrison's reading glasses, convinced they might help her see clues others had missed. She'd reorganized his entire library using 3 different classification systems. She'd even hired a handwriting expert to analyze his personal notes for hidden meanings. You know, your uncle always said the best puzzles hide in plain sight, she said, touching the spine of a leather-bound book. What do you mean? When you were little, you two would play those treasure hunt games. He'd leave clues that seemed impossible until you stopped overthinking them. She paused at the astronomy section, running her fingers along the titles. He used to say the answer was always simpler than people made it. I remembered those treasure hunts vividly now. Uncle Harrison would spend hours setting them up, hiding clues throughout his house while I waited impatiently outside. The final prize was always something small but meaningful. A rare coin, a vintage puzzle, once a first edition of my favorite book. But the real joy was in the solving, the moment when all the pieces clicked together and revealed something beautiful. Mom, do you remember the last treasure hunt he made for me? She smiled sadly. Your 16th birthday. He hid clues in his favorite books, and the final answer was written in invisible ink. You needed to hold the paper near the fireplace to read it. What did it say? The greatest treasure is time spent with people who understand you. She wiped her eyes. He was right, you know. I miss those family gatherings when we all actually talked to each other instead of scheming about money. After Mom left, I covered the door with a chair and returned to the brass plate. 4 symbols. The riddle mentioned where stories sleep. Definitely books. But which books? There were thousands in this room, organized by subject, author, and publication date, across floor-to-ceiling shelves that required a rolling ladder to access the highest sections. Uncle Harrison had been obsessive about his library. He'd spent decades collecting first editions, rare manuscripts, and books in languages most people had never heard of. Each book had its place, and he'd know immediately if something was moved even an inch. As kids, we'd been afraid to touch anything, certain we'd disturb some cosmic order he'd spent years perfecting. I spent the next hour examining every book with a crescent moon, key, or hourglass on the spine or cover. I found astronomy textbooks with moon imagery, locksmith manuals with key illustrations, philosophy books about time with hourglass symbols, but nothing felt right. Nothing connected to the riddle or to Uncle Harrison personally. Then I noticed Uncle Harrison's personal journal collection on the highest shelf, books he'd written in, not just read. These weren't part of his organized library. They were scattered across the top shelf like an afterthought, leather-bound volumes in various sizes and colors. Using the rolling ladder, I climbed up and found his dream journal from 1987. On the cover, drawn in his careful handwriting, was a tiny crescent moon. I'd seen him sketch in this journal during family vacations, recording dreams he found particularly vivid or meaningful. Inside the front cover, he'd written, "Dreams are where stories sleep." My pulse quickened. I searched through more journals and found his language study notebook from his year abroad in graduate school. It had a small key drawn on the spine. Inside, language is the key to all knowledge. The book with an hourglass was his autobiography, never published, filled with memories from his childhood through his early business success. Inside, time reveals all secrets. But what about the open book symbol? I searched for 20 minutes, checking every journal, every notebook, every volume he'd personally annotated. Nothing matched the fourth symbol. Then I realized it wasn't a book I needed to find. It was a book I needed to open, or maybe something that opened like a book. I climbed back up and examined the bookshelf itself more carefully. Uncle Harrison had designed much of this room personally, working with craftsmen to create custom shelving and hidden storage. Behind where the 3 journals had been sitting was a small carved symbol, an open book. I pressed it. Click. A section of the bookshelf swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a space the size of a walk-in closet. The hidden chamber was lit by a single overhead bulb and contained another desk, much smaller than the destroyed one in the main study. The walls were covered with photographs, family pictures going back decades, including many of me and Uncle Harrison working on puzzles together. On the desk was a single drawer with an old-fashioned keyhole. Taped to the top was a small brass key, the same key Derek had tried to steal from Uncle Harrison's safe during the funeral reception, not knowing what it unlocked. Inside the drawer was a manila envelope and a letter in Uncle Harrison's careful handwriting. Congratulations, you solved the riddle not through brute force or expensive consultants, but by remembering who I really was. You understood that this was never about cryptography or hidden compartments, it was about knowing the person behind the puzzle. The envelope contains account information for a trust I established 6 months ago. The money is yours, but there are conditions. Read them carefully before deciding whether to accept. My hands shook as I opened the envelope and read the conditions. You must use $1 million to establish college funds for every child in our family under 18. You must donate $5 million to literacy programs within 1 year. You may keep the remaining $41 million, but only if you sign a document promising never to speak to any family member who damaged my house during the search. If you refuse any condition, everything goes to charity and you get nothing. You have 24 hours to decide. I sat in that hidden chamber for an hour, thinking about my family downstairs and scattered across the city. Dad, who'd been calling me daily since the will reading, suddenly interested in my life after years of barely acknowledging my existence. Mom, who'd stopped working to focus on our puzzle, spending money we didn't have on experts and equipment. Derek, who'd just destroyed priceless furniture in his desperation to prove he wasn't a failure. But there were others too. My cousin Tommy, only 15, who'd started selling his baseball card collection to help his parents hire puzzle consultants. My Aunt Linda's twin daughters, both sophomores in college, who dropped out for the semester to focus on the riddle full-time. My cousin Brad Jr., who'd taken unpaid leave from his job as a paramedic, convinced this was his family's ticket to financial security. They weren't bad people, but they'd become strangers, consumed by the possibility of instant wealth and blinded by their own desperation. I heard shouting from downstairs, then breaking glass. More shouting. The sounds echoed through the house. Uncle Harrison's peaceful sanctuary turned into a battleground. When I finally climbed down from the hidden chamber, carefully closing the secret door behind me, I found chaos in the kitchen. Dad and Derek were in a screaming match while Mom cried at the table. My Aunt Linda was on her phone with someone, probably her lawyer. Uncle Brad paced by the windows, gesticulating wildly as he talked to Derek's hired graduate students. Emma sat in the corner, still methodically destroying books, now working on a collection of poetry that Uncle Harrison had annotated by hand. Tommy stood by the back door, looking like he wanted to escape. Jessica was nowhere to be seen, probably at her hotel researching legal precedents for contesting wills. I know one of you found something, Dad was yelling. The timeline doesn't add up. Someone's been lying for days. Maybe because you hired people to follow us, Derek shot back. I've seen your investigator's car parked outside my apartment. You're paranoid, Uncle Brad interjected. Just because you're losing doesn't mean everyone else is cheating. I'm not losing anything, Derek snarled. I'm the only one here with actual technical knowledge. If anyone's going to solve this, it's me. Really? Said Jessica, who just walked in with coffee and a smugness that made my skin crawl. Because my literature professors found 17 different possible interpretations of the riddle, and none of them point to anything you've been working on. Your professors don't know Uncle Harrison, I said quietly. They ignored me. Stop. Everyone turned. I held up the envelope. I found it. The room went dead silent. Where? Derek demanded, his voice hoarse from shouting. Hidden chamber behind the bookshelf, triggered by symbols I found embedded in his desk. Dad stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and hope. What does it say? How much do we each get? We don't get anything, I said. I do. The explosion was immediate. Derek lunged toward me, but Dad grabbed him. Mom started hyperventilating. My aunt began shouting about contesting the will again. Uncle Brad demanded to see the documents. Jessica accused me of forging everything. Through the chaos, I heard my phone buzzing. Text messages from family members who weren't even here, cousins from out of state who'd heard the news, Uncle Harrison's elderly sister demanding updates, my brother who was deployed overseas but somehow monitoring the situation through social media. But, I continued when the shouting died down, there are conditions. I read them Uncle Harrison's requirements. The room fell silent again as they processed what this meant. So you have to choose, Mom said slowly. wiping her tears. The money or us? I looked around at my family. Derek with his bloodshot eyes and desperate edge. Dad with his clenched fists and barely controlled rage. Mom with her mascara running and her hands shaking. These people who'd spent 3 weeks lying to each other, stealing from each other, destroying Uncle Harrison's beautiful home in their greed. But I also saw Emma, who'd looked up from her book destruction with shame in her eyes. Tommy, who'd never wanted any part of this competition, but had been dragged into it by circumstance. Even Derek, whose desperation came from years of feeling like a disappointment, not from inherent cruelty. These weren't evil people. They were desperate people who'd lost themselves in the promise of easy money. Uncle Harrison had known this would happen. He'd designed it to happen. Actually, I said, I think Uncle Harrison gave me a third option. I pulled out my phone and called his lawyer. Mr. Peterson, it's me. I solved the riddle, but I want to modify the conditions. Yes, I understand I'm entitled to do that under Section 12 of the trust agreement. Here's what I want to propose. I told him my plan. Everyone listened, their faces shifting from anger to confusion to cautious hope. Here's what's going to happen, I announced after hanging up. I'm taking the money, all of it. But I'm also going to sue every single one of you for property damage to Uncle Harrison's estate. The shouting started again, but I held up my hand. Unless, I continued, you agree to my terms. I'd spent 3 weeks watching my family destroy themselves for money. Now I was going to use that money to put them back together. First, everyone apologizes to everyone else. Not fake apologies, real ones. Derek, you apologize to Uncle Harrison's memory for destroying his furniture. Dad, you apologize to Mom for hiring someone to spy on her. Mom, you apologize to all of us for lying about working alone. Everyone apologizes for what they've said and done these past 3 weeks. They looked skeptical, but desperate enough to nod. Second, we're having family dinners again. Real ones. Every Sunday for the next year. No phones, no business talk, no mention of money or inheritance or who deserves what. And if we refuse? My aunt asked, her voice carefully controlled. Then I keep Uncle Harrison's original conditions. I take the money and never speak to any of you again. And I pursue maximum damages for the destruction of his property. The room was quiet for a long time. Through the windows, I could see Uncle Harrison's garden where we'd played as children, now trampled by construction crews looking for buried clues. Derek was the first to speak. I'm sorry, he said, looking directly at me. I threatened you with a crowbar over money that wasn't even mine. That's not who I want to be. His voice cracked on the last words. This was the cousin who'd taught me chess, who'd patiently explained mathematical concepts when I struggled with homework, who'd driven 6 hours to attend my high school graduation, even though he was in the middle of finals. I'm sorry too, Mom said, turning to Dad. I hired my own investigator to follow you because I thought you were hiding something from me. That was wrong. I did hide something, Dad admitted. I took out a second mortgage on our house to pay for the construction crew. I didn't want you to worry. One by one, they all apologized. Some were stilted and awkward, but they were genuine. Jessica apologized for accusing me of theft. Aunt Linda apologized for spreading rumors about Derek's mental state. Uncle Brad apologized for encouraging the competitive atmosphere. Emma apologized for destroying Uncle Harrison's books. Tommy apologized for not speaking up when he saw the family falling apart. The apologies took nearly an hour. Some people cried. Some got angry again before circling back to remorse. But gradually, something shifted in the room. The desperate edge softened. People looked at each other instead of glaring. Okay, I said when the last apology was given. Now here's how the money works. I explained my revised plan. I'd use Uncle Harrison's fortune to establish what I called the Harrison Family Foundation. Every family member would receive a guaranteed annual income of $50,000, enough to live comfortably, but not enough to stop working entirely. The college funds for the kids would be more generous, full tuition plus living expenses for any accredited program. But the foundation has rules, I continued. If you're arrested for anything more serious than a traffic ticket, you lose your income for that year. If you're cruel to another family member at Sunday dinners, you lose a month's payment. If you damage someone else's property out of greed again, you're out permanently. Who decides what counts as cruel? Mom asked. All of us. Majority vote, including the kids once they turn 16. What about the rest of the money? Derek asked. $10 million goes to literacy programs like Uncle Harrison wanted. $5 million stays in reserve for family emergencies, medical bills, natural disasters, genuine crises. The remainder funds the annual payments and gets reinvested to keep the foundation sustainable. It wasn't perfect, but it was fair. Uncle Harrison had wanted to teach us something about family and greed. I was making sure we learned the lesson without destroying ourselves in the process. Dad raised his hand like we were in a meeting. What if someone doesn't want to participate? What if they'd rather just take their share and leave? There are no shares, I said. That's the point. Uncle Harrison left everything to one person, me. But I'm choosing to create something that benefits everyone, as long as everyone participates in good faith. And if the foundation fails? Aunt Linda asked. If you die or become incapacitated? I've already spoken to Mr. Peterson about that. There's a succession plan. The foundation continues under professional management, but the family payments stop if the Sunday dinner requirement isn't maintained. It was manipulative, I realized. I was using Uncle Harrison's money to force my family to stay connected, but maybe that's what we needed. Maybe some manipulation was justified if it prevented us from drifting apart forever. The conversation continued for another 2 hours. We worked out logistics, discussed concerns, negotiated details. It felt like the first real family meeting we'd had in years, everyone contributing instead of competing. Finally, we put it to a vote. Unanimous approval, though Derek abstained rather than voting yes. "I need time to think about this," he said. "Not about the money, about whether I can trust myself to be the person you're asking me to be." "You have until next Sunday," I said. "That's when we start the dinners." 3 days later, Derek showed up at my apartment with a bottle of wine and a resignation letter from his job at a tech support call center. "I've been thinking about what Uncle Harrison said to me the last time we talked," he said as I poured the wine. "He told me that intelligence without purpose is just sophisticated despair. What are you going to do? Go back to school, finish my degree." Uncle Harrison was right. I do understand complex systems. I just need to find ones worth understanding. The first Sunday dinner was awkward. Nobody knew how to act normal after 3 weeks of treating each other like enemies. Tommy brought a card game. Jessica brought homemade bread as a peace offering. Derek showed up with flowers for Mom, apologizing again for the private investigator incident. But slowly, we remembered how to be a family. Tommy told us about his art classes. Emma shared her plans for medical school. Jessica talked about leaving corporate law to work for a nonprofit. Even Dad and Uncle Brad managed to have a conversation that didn't involve business or money. By the 5th Sunday dinner, it felt natural again. We were telling stories, sharing problems, celebrating each other's successes. The foundation payments had given everyone breathing room to pursue what they actually wanted instead of what they thought would pay the bills. 6 months later, we gathered for Uncle Harrison's estate sale. We were selling the house. None of us could afford to maintain it properly, and the memories were too complicated. But we'd kept Sunday dinners religiously. Derek had gone back to MIT and was thriving. Dad and Mom were seeing a marriage counselor. My teenage sister had stopped charging people to search her room and started volunteering at the literacy center I'd funded. The estate sale was surreal. Strangers walked through Uncle Harrison's home, examining his possessions with the cold eye of potential buyers. They didn't know the stories behind the objects, which puzzle had taken him 6 months to solve, which book had changed his worldview, which painting he'd stared at for hours when he was feeling lonely. A dealer in antique furniture bought Uncle Harrison's restored desk for $12,000, having no idea it had once hidden the answer to a $47 million riddle. The brass plate was still there, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. I'd decided to leave it as Uncle Harrison's final secret. As we watched people bid on Uncle Harrison's belongings, Derek stood beside me holding a catalog. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "You could have taken all $47 million and never dealt with us again." I watched Dad help Mom carry a box of Uncle Harrison's books to her car, books the auction house had deemed too common to sell. They were laughing about something, probably one of Uncle Harrison's terrible puns written in the margins. "No," I said. "Uncle Harrison was right. The best puzzles hide in plain sight." "What do you mean?" "The real riddle wasn't about finding hidden money. It was about finding a way to keep our family together despite the money." Derek smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from him since before he dropped out of college. He would have liked that interpretation. "Yeah," I agreed. He really would have. As we drove away from the estate for the last time, I thought about Uncle Harrison's final lesson. He'd shown us who we really were when faced with sudden wealth, petty, desperate, willing to betray each other for money. Then he'd given us a chance to choose who we wanted to be going forward. We'd chosen each other, even when it would have been easier to walk away. That was worth more than $47 million, but the monthly foundation payments didn't hurt either. A year later, at our 52nd consecutive Sunday dinner, Derek announced he'd been accepted into a PhD program studying artificial intelligence ethics. "I want to work on systems that help people instead of replacing them," he said. Mom had started a small accounting firm specializing in nonprofit organizations. Dad was teaching carpentry classes at the community center. My sister was planning to study library science. Everyone had found something meaningful to do with their guaranteed income. "You know what I realized?" Mom said as we cleared the dishes. "Uncle Harrison didn't just leave us money. He left us instructions on how to be a family." She was right. The riddle, the competition, the forced reconciliation, it had all been designed to teach us something. Not about puzzles or hidden treasure, but about the difference between being related to people and actually caring about them. 2 years later, Tommy graduated from art school and had his first gallery showing. The centerpiece was a portrait of Uncle Harrison sitting in his study, surrounded by books and puzzles, with the faint outline of our family visible in the shadows behind him. "He's still watching over us," Tommy said during his opening speech, "making sure we remember what really matters." Derek had completed his PhD and was working for a tech company that specialized in ethical AI development. He'd named his first algorithm the Harrison Protocol, a system designed to prevent AI from being used to manipulate or exploit vulnerable people. Uncle Harrison always said technology should serve humanity, not the other way around. Derek explained to a tech journalist. "I'm just making sure his philosophy lives on." 3 years later, we used the Foundation's emergency fund for its first major test. Cousin Emma's daughter was diagnosed with leukemia, and the experimental treatment her insurance wouldn't cover cost $380,000. Within 24 hours, we'd approved the funding and arranged for the best pediatric oncologist in the country. "This is what Uncle Harrison wanted," Mom said as we sat in the hospital waiting room during Emma's daughter's first treatment. "Not just the money, the knowledge that we take care of each other." 5 years later, the Harrison Family Foundation had grown beyond Uncle Harrison's original $47 million. Smart investments and careful management had increased the principal to nearly $75 million. We'd funded 12 college educations, 3 startup businesses, 1 documentary film, and countless smaller dreams that family members might never have pursued without the financial safety net. But the most important measurement wasn't financial. It was the fact that we'd never missed a Sunday dinner. 260 consecutive weeks of family time, through holidays and vacations and personal crises and professional triumphs. Remember when we almost destroyed each other over money? Jessica said during our 5th anniversary dinner. I prefer to remember how we saved each other with it, I replied. Derek raised his glass. To Uncle Harrison, who knew us better than we knew ourselves. To Uncle Harrison, we all echoed. I still had the original letter from Uncle Harrison, the one explaining his conditions, but I'd never signed the document promising to cut off family members who damaged his house. I'd found a better way to honor his memory. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment, I'd read the letter again and imagine Uncle Harrison chuckling at how his final puzzle had turned out. He'd wanted to know if we could choose love over money, cooperation over competition, forgiveness over resentment. We'd passed his test, and we'd all won the prize. The real treasure, as Uncle Harrison had written in that invisible ink message years ago, was time spent with people who understand you. He'd given us 47 million, but more importantly, he'd given us back each other. And that was a legacy worth more than any amount of money.